The axle snapped with a crack that cut through the rising wind. Thomas Brennan gripped the carriage door as the vehicle lurched sideways, wheels grinding against frozen earth. His driver fought the reins, but the horses whinnied in panic, sensing the storm bearing down on them. "Get them free!" Thomas shouted over the wind. "Before they bolt!" The driver worked fast, unhitching the team with trembling fingers. Snow began falling harder, thick flakes that turned the December afternoon into swirling white chaos. Montana Territory stretched empty in all directions, the trail barely visible now. "I'm riding for town," the driver called, already mounting one horse. "Too far for you on foot in this, Mr. Brennan." Thomas started to protest, but the man was gone, both horses disappearing into the blizzard. The wind hit with sudden fury, driving snow into Thomas's face, ice crystals stinging his skin. His expensive wool coat, tailored in San Francisco, felt paper-thin against nature's assault. He couldn't stay with the carriage. He'd freeze before anyone returned. Through the whiteout, something flickered. A light. Faint and distant, barely visible between gusts. Thomas fixed his eyes on it and stumbled forward, each step a battle against wind that wanted to knock him flat. His hands went numb. His face burned with cold. The light grew closer. A cabin materialized from the storm, small and weathered, smoke rising from a stone chimney. Thomas staggered toward the door, raising his fist to knock. It opened before his knuckles touched wood. A woman stood in the doorway, backlit by firelight. She wore a faded calico dress, threadbare at the elbows, her dark hair pulled back in a simple bun. Her face was weathered but young, maybe 30, with eyes that assessed him in one quick glance. "Get inside before you freeze," she said, stepping back. Thomas didn't argue. He crossed the threshold into warmth that felt like salvation. 2 children peered at him from beside the fireplace. A girl about 9 and a boy maybe 7. Their faces curious and unafraid. The cabin was one room. Rough-hewn walls, patched in places with flattened tin. A table with 4 mismatched chairs. 2 narrow beds against the far wall, and a fireplace built from riverstone. Everything showed the marks of repeated mending, careful hands making do with little. But the fire burned bright. Something simmered in a pot that smelled of vegetables and hope. The children were clean, their clothes patched but whole. "I'm Thomas Brennan," he managed through chattering teeth. "My carriage broke down." The storm. "I saw it coming," the woman said, already moving to the stove. "Sit by the fire. You need to warm up slow or you'll shock your system." She poured something into a chipped mug and pressed it into his hands. Hot tea, weak but scalding. Thomas wrapped his frozen fingers around the ceramic, feeling returning to his extremities in painful tingles. "I'm Jenny Murphy," the woman said. "These are my children, Sarah and Billy. Storm'll be 3 days, maybe more. We've little, but you're welcome to it." Thomas looked at her. Really looked. She stood straight despite worn clothes, met his eyes without flinching. There was no apology in her voice, no shame, just simple dignity. His coat was finest wool, custom made. The buttons were real silver. His boots cost more than her table probably did, but she had the fire. She had warmth. She had opened her door without hesitation. "Thank you," Thomas said quietly. "I'm grateful." Jenny nodded and turned back to her stove. Outside. The wind howled like something alive. Inside, the fire crackled steady and warm. Thomas realized his expensive coat couldn't warm him the way her simple fire did. Jenny served supper an hour later. Thin vegetable soup in wooden bowls. Cornbread that had more corn than bread. Weak tea. Thomas was accustomed to 5-course meals in San Francisco restaurants. Roast beef and wine that cost more per bottle than most men earned in a month. The soup tasted better than any meal he remembered. "Is it all right?" Jenny asked, watching him. "I know it's not much." "It's perfect," Thomas said honestly. "Thank you for sharing." Billy stared at him across the table, spoon forgotten in his hand. "Are you a cowboy?" "Billy," Jenny said gently. "Mind your manners." "No, son." Thomas smiled. "I work with money. I'm a banker." Billy's face scrunched in confusion. "What kind of work is that?" Thomas opened his mouth to explain, then realized he had no good answer for a child. He moved numbers between columns. He calculated interest on loans. He sat in an office while other men built and grew and created. "I help people," he finally said. "Or I'm supposed to." Jenny gave him a thoughtful look but said nothing. After supper, she cleared the table while the children did chores without being asked. Sarah swept the floor. Billy brought in more firewood from the covered pile outside, making multiple trips, his small arms straining. Thomas noticed his torn coat sleeve hanging on a peg by the door. Jenny had taken it without asking, would mend it without expecting anything in return. When had someone last done something for him expecting nothing back? Sarah produced a battered book from beneath one of the beds, its cover water-stained but intact. "Mama, will you read?" Jenny settled into the only chair with full backing she'd given Thomas that chair at supper, without comment. The children sat on the floor beside her, leaning against her knees. She opened the book and began to read, her voice transforming the humble cabin into somewhere magical. Thomas watched from his seat on the bench. The children's faces glowed in the firelight, rapt with attention. Jenny read with expression, changing voices for different characters, making them laugh at the funny parts. He thought of his own children, Margaret, 13, who played piano with technical perfection and zero joy. Thomas Jr., 11, who recited Latin declensions like a well-trained parrot. They had private tutors for every subject. They lived in a mansion with 12 rooms. They'd never known hunger or cold or want. They'd also never looked at him the way Sarah and Billy looked at their mother. Jenny caught him staring. She smiled, tentative and tired, then returned to her book. Outside. The storm battered the cabin walls. Inside. Her voice wove warmth and wonder from simple words on a page. When the children finally went to bed, Jenny banked the fire for the night. Thomas lay on the floor pallet she'd insisted he take. She would sleep sitting up on the bench, she'd said. But he suspected she'd give that to the children and take the floor herself. "You all right, Mr. Brennan?" she asked quietly. Thomas stared at the ceiling, watching firelight dance across rough wood. He didn't know how to answer. He was warm and fed and safe from the storm. He should be fine. But something in his chest felt cracked open, and he couldn't make it close. "I don't know," he finally whispered. Jenny nodded as if she understood, then settled on the bench with a blanket. Within minutes, her breathing deepened into sleep. Thomas lay awake long into the night, listening to the wind howl and trying to remember the last time he'd felt this warm. Thomas couldn't sleep. The floor pallet was more comfortable than his feather bed at home, but that wasn't what kept him awake. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Billy's face asking what kind of work was money. He saw Sarah and Billy doing arithmetic earlier that evening. Before the reading, Jenny had used dried beans from a jar, making a game of it. If you have 7 beans and give 3 to your sister, how many for your pie? Billy had counted carefully, touching each bean. Then he'd looked at his sister and pushed 4 beans toward her instead of keeping 4 for himself. "She's littler," Billy had said. "She needs more pie." Jenny had smiled and kissed his head. "That's a generous heart, Billy boy. But let's make sure you got your numbers right too." Thomas had watched from his corner, something twisting in his chest. His own son could calculate compound interest. Thomas Jr. had tutors for mathematics, for Latin, for literature and history and science. But had Thomas ever taught his son that giving 4 when you could keep 4 was sometimes the right answer? He thought of his late wife, Elizabeth. 5 years since consumption took her. 5 years of burying his grief in ledgers and accounts. He'd thrown himself into building his banking empire, into providing for his children, into making sure they never wanted for anything. He'd given them French lessons and piano instruction in summer homes in the mountains. He'd given them everything except himself. He thought of Margaret at her piano, playing Chopin with perfect technique and dead eyes. He thought of Thomas Jr. reciting Caesar's Gallic Wars without understanding why Romans fought or what. Conquest cost, they lived in a mansion. They had private tutors. They wore expensive clothes and ate imported foods. They'd never learned the arithmetic of the heart. Jenny stirred on the bench, adjusting her blanket, even in sleep. She looked tired. Thomas could see the toll that poverty took. The lines around her eyes. The roughness of her hands. She worked herself to exhaustion keeping this farm running, keeping her children fed and clothed and educated. But her children knew how to laugh. They knew how to turn chores into games, how to find joy in a simple story. They knew that giving more than required showed character. What did his children know except that money bought comfort? The wind screamed outside, rattling the cabin walls. Thomas pulled the thin blanket closer and admitted the truth he'd been avoiding since he stepped through that door. He didn't just need shelter from the storm. He needed to learn what Jenny knew. He needed to understand how poverty could hold such richness, how hardship could produce such strength. He needed to know how she taught her children to measure wealth in kindness instead of coins. This wasn't about waiting out bad weather anymore. Thomas whispered into the darkness. "What have I done to my children?" No one heard but himself. It was the first honest question he'd asked in years. Outside, the blizzard intensified, burying the world in white. Inside, the fire burned low, casting long shadows across the floor. Thomas closed his eyes and tried to imagine teaching his son that 7 beans given when 3 were asked showed a generous heart. The image wouldn't come. He'd built walls too high, dug the distance too deep. But maybe, if he paid attention these next few days, he could learn to tear those walls down. Maybe it wasn't too late to become the father his children needed. The wind howled. Thomas finally slept, dreaming of beans and arithmetic and a woman who measured wealth in laughter instead of ledgers. The second day dawned white and howling. Thomas woke to find Jenny already up, rationing supplies at the table. 5 people now instead of 3. The soup would be thinner. The cornbread divided smaller. She never complained. Thomas pulled himself up, every muscle stiff from the hard floor. "Let me help." "No need," Jenny said, but her voice was kind. "You're a guest." "I'm an extra mouth," Thomas countered. "What can I do?" She considered him, then handed him a bucket. "Snow needs melting for water. Bring in a full bucket and set it by the fire." It was simple work, but Thomas felt useful. He made 3 trips while Jenny cooked breakfast more thin porridge, but she added a precious spoonful of honey to each bowl. Billy's eyes went wide. "Honey day?" he asked hopefully. "Special occasion?" Jenny said. "We have company, and the storm's fierce. We need our strength." After breakfast, Jenny cleared the table and brought out the children's lessons. Thomas watched from his corner as she transformed scarcity into abundance. Dried beans became mathematics. Charcoal on boards became letters and words. Songs became memory devices for facts and dates. "If I have 9 beans and I owe the store 3. How many beans left for seed?" Jenny asked Billy. Billy counted carefully. 6 beans. "Mama." "That's right. And if each bean grows into a plant with 10 beans, how many will I have at harvest?" Billy's face scrunched in concentration. Thomas found himself calculating 260 beans. The boy worked it out slowly, using his fingers. But he got there. 60, Billy announced triumphantly. "Good work," Jenny praised. "That's multiplication. That's how farmers plan their crops." Thomas cleared his throat. "May I add something?" Jenny looked surprised but nodded. "Billy, that's also how bankers work," Thomas said. "If I loan someone $3 now, and they pay me back $3 plus $1 interest later, I can loan $4 next time. The money grows, just like beans." Billy's eyes widened. "So you help people get what they need now, and they pay later," Close enough. Thomas smiled. Jenny met his eyes over the children's heads. Something passed between them, acknowledgement, maybe respect. She smiled, tired but genuine. And Thomas felt warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The afternoon crawled by. The storm showed no signs of breaking. Jenny taught Sarah to write a letter, explaining how words on paper could carry thoughts across distance. Sarah concentrated hard, tongue between her teeth, forming careful letters. "Who should I write to?" Sarah asked. "Anyone you want." Jenny said, "Grandma in Missouri. Maybe I'll write to Pa." Sarah decided, "Tell him about the storm." Jenny's face went still for just a moment. "That's nice, honey. He'd like that." Thomas understood. The girl's father was dead, but Jenny let her daughter write anyway. Let her process grief in her own time, her own way. When had Thomas last let his children grieve their mother? He'd hired tutors and bought distractions. Kept them so busy they couldn't feel the loss. He'd thought he was helping. Maybe he'd just been running. Evening came early, the sky dark by 4 o'clock. Jenny stretched the soup even thinner for supper. But she made the children laugh with stories about pioneer families who'd survived worse storms. She turned hardship into adventure, fear into excitement. "We're pioneers," she told them, "surviving on our wits and our courage." After supper, while the children played quietly with wooden blocks Billy had carved himself, Thomas noticed his coat hanging on the peg. Jenny had mended the torn sleeve, her stitches small and precise. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "You'll need it whole when you go back to your world." Jenny replied, not looking up from the sock she was darning. "Back to your world." She'd drawn the line clearly. They existed in different spheres, and these few days were an accident of weather. Nothing more. Thomas wanted to argue, wanted to say that maybe worlds could touch, could overlap, could blur together. But he had no right to that conversation. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Jenny glanced at him over the children's heads. Her smile was tired but genuine. The first real smile she'd given him. Something shifted in the cabin's warm air. Something unspoken but undeniable. The blizzard howled outside. Inside, 5 people survived together, sharing what little they had, learning that generosity stretched further than money. Thomas watched Jenny bend over her darning, firelight catching in her hair, and felt something crack open in his chest. He was falling for a woman he barely knew, in a world he didn't understand, learning lessons he should have mastered years ago. And he had 1 day left before the storm broke and he had to leave. The third night fell quiet. The storm still raged but seemed to have exhausted its fury, settling into steady snow instead of violent blizzard. The children, worn out from indoor play, fell asleep early. Thomas and Jenny sat by the fire, the cabin creaking around them. She darned socks. He pretended to read her battered book but mostly watched her hands move. Efficient and sure. "Tell me about your children," Jenny said finally, not looking up. Thomas set the book aside. "Margaret is 13. Thomas Jr. is 11. "That's their ages," Jenny said gently. "Tell me about them." He thought about it, really thought. What could he say? That Margaret played piano beautifully but joylessly, that Thomas Jr. excelled at Latin, but had never built anything with his hands, that they lived in a mansion, but never laughed. They have everything, he said quietly. Nothing makes them happy. Jenny's hand stilled on the sock. Maybe they have everything except what matters. "What's that you?" She said simply, "Present. Paying attention, teaching them what makes life rich." Thomas felt the words like a blow. "I provide for them. I've given them the best education money can buy." "Providing is part of loving," Jenny said carefully. "But it ain't all of it. Love is presence, attention, teaching them what makes life worth living." She gestured at the humble cabin. "We don't have money, but my children know they matter. They know how to find joy in small things. They know beans can be math problems and snow can be an adventure. That's wealth that lasts. Well, how do you do it? Thomas asked. How do you make them see that I show them? Jenny said. Every day. I'm there when they wake up. I teach them myself. With my own hands. I let them see me struggle and figure things out. They learn that life is hard, but we face it together. She set down her darning and looked at him directly. Your children don't need more things. Mr. Brennan. They need you, not your money. You. Thomas stared into the fire. Shame burning hotter than the flames. I don't know how to give them that. I've forgotten how. Then learn. Jenny said. It's not too late. They're still young. They still need their father. Will you teach me? The words came out before Thomas could stop them. Will you show me how? Jenny's eyes softened with something like pity. I'm teaching you right now. These 3 days you're seeing how it works. You just have to decide if you're willing to do it once the storm ends. Silence fell between them, heavy with meaning. Thomas wanted to say more, wanted to close the distance between them, wanted to tell her that she was beautiful and wise and everything he'd been missing. But she was a widow struggling to survive. He was a wealthy banker who'd stumbled into her world by accident. The gap between them was wider than this cabin, deeper than the snow outside. Tell me about your husband. Thomas said instead. Jenny's face changed, grief and love mixing in her expression. Daniel was a good man, worked himself to death trying to make this farm prosper. He loved us fiercely, gave us everything he had. I want my children to remember that not that we're poor, but that we were loved. I'm sorry for your loss. I miss him every day, Jenny said, but I learned something from watching him die. Love isn't about what you leave behind. It's about what you give while you're here. Daniel gave us his whole heart. That's what mattered. Thomas thought about Elizabeth. Dead 5 years. He'd provided for her too, given her a mansion and servants and fine clothes. But had he given her his whole heart, or had he kept part of himself locked away? Protected. Focused on business and success. He couldn't remember the last time he'd told her he loved her. I thought providing everything was enough. Thomas admitted. It's not. Is it? No. Jenny said softly. It's not. They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. Outside, wind continued its assault on the cabin walls. Inside, something fragile and precious existed in the space between them, understanding. Maybe recognition. The possibility of more. Thomas looked at Jenny across the firelight. She was beautiful, not despite her hardship, but somehow because of it. Struggle had refined her, taught her what mattered, stripped away everything false. He felt something he hadn't felt since Elizabeth died, hope, and something more dangerous, longing. Storm might break tomorrow, Jenny said abruptly. Standing. We should sleep. Thomas nodded. But they both knew what tomorrow meant. His departure. Their separation. The end of this strange, precious interlude. Jenny banked the fire and settled on her bench. Thomas lay on his pallet, staring at the darkness. 3 days. That's all he'd had. 3 days to learn what he should have known all along. He prayed it would be enough. He prayed he could carry these lessons home and become the father his children needed. He prayed the image of Jenny's face by firelight wouldn't haunt him for the rest of his life. Outside, the storm began to die. Morning came with devastating clarity. Thomas woke to brilliant sunlight streaming through the cabin's single window, illuminating every crack and patch in the walls. The storm had passed, leaving a world transformed pristine white, sparkling, cruelly beautiful. He had to leave. Jenny was already up, distant in a way she hadn't been the night before. She'd rebuilt her walls overnight, protecting herself from the inevitable. She moved around the cabin efficiently, making breakfast, checking on the children, avoiding Thomas's eyes. Storm's over, she said unnecessarily. Roads will be passable by afternoon? Thomas nodded, throat tight. I should get back to town. My family will be worried. Of course. Jenny's voice was carefully neutral. The town will send someone to check on us. You can ride with them. Sarah and Billy seemed oblivious to the tension. They chattered about the snow, about building snow forts when it was safe to go outside. Billy demonstrated how deep the drifts were with his hands, exaggerating wildly. Sarah rolled her eyes but smiled. Thomas tried to memorize everything. The way morning light turned Jenny's hair copper, how Billy's laugh sounded like bells, the smell of weak coffee and hope. He wanted to carry it all with him, this brief glimpse of what life could be. By noon, riders appeared on the horizon. The town had sent a rescue party once the storm broke. Thomas's driver was among them, sheepish but relieved to find his employer alive. Got your horses back, Mr. Brennan. The driver said, Soon as the storm cleared, I came looking. Jenny stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself. She looked small in the bright sunlight, vulnerable despite her strength. Thomas wanted to say something profound, something that would make her understand what these 3 days had meant. Thank you, was all that came out. For everything. Anyone would have done the same. Jenny said. But they both knew that wasn't true. Billy barreled forward and wrapped his arms around Thomas's waist. Will you come back? Thomas looked at Jenny. She wouldn't meet his eyes, her face carefully blank. He understood she was protecting herself, protecting her children from hoping for something impossible. Men like him didn't come back to women like her. That's just how the world worked. I don't know, son, Thomas said honestly, touching Billy's hair. I don't know. He mounted his horse, his mended coat warm against the cold. The rescue party turned their horses toward town. Thomas looked back once, saw Jenny in the doorway with her children, framed by the humble cabin. The distance between them grew with each step. The sun on snow was blinding. His coat was perfectly mended, Jenny's careful stitches invisible unless you knew where to look. His body was warm and fed and whole. His heart felt broken open, exposed to elements no coat could protect against. They rode in silence toward town. The landscape sparkled, pristine and empty. Thomas's chest ached with every breath. He tried to tell himself it was just gratitude, just relief at surviving the storm. But he'd survived worse things than weather in that cabin. He'd survived seeing himself clearly, understanding what he'd become, recognizing what he'd lost. He'd survived 3 days of watching a woman turn poverty into richness through nothing but love and attention and presence. He'd survived falling for someone he couldn't have. The town appeared on the horizon, buildings clustered and dark against the snow. His banking office, his mansion on the hill, his old life waiting to reclaim him. Thomas looked back one final time, but the cabin had disappeared behind them, swallowed by distance and glare. He touched the mended sleeve of his coat and promised himself he wouldn't forget. He just didn't know how he could possibly go back to who he'd been before. Thomas's mansion felt like a mausoleum. He walked through the front door into marble and silence. 12 rooms echoing empty, despite servants moving quietly through their duties. His children barely noticed his return. "Father," Margaret said from the piano, not pausing her practice. "You're back. We were told you were safe." Thomas Jr. looked up from his Latin text. "Good afternoon, Father. Did you suffer any injury?" They spoke to him like strangers, polite, distant strangers who happened to share a house. Thomas stood in the grand foyer, snow melting from his boots onto expensive carpet, and saw his home through Jenny's eyes. Too much. Too cold. Too empty of anything that mattered. "I'm fine," he said. "I'm glad to see you." Margaret played scales. Thomas Jr. bent back over his book. Neither responded, that evening. Thomas watched his children through dinner. Margaret ate with perfect posture, answered questions in complete sentences, never once smiled. Thomas Jr. recited what he'd learned that day: Latin vocabulary, European geography, mathematical theorems without showing any enthusiasm for the knowledge itself. Their governess, Miss Hartwell, praised their progress. Their tutor, Professor Morrison, detailed their academic achievements. Both were skilled educators, well-paid professionals who taught with competence and zero warmth. His children were excelling at everything. They were empty vessels being filled with information but not wisdom, facts but not meaning, skills but not joy. They'd never learned that giving 4 beans when you could keep 4 showed a generous heart. The week crept by. Thomas tried to focus on banking business, but numbers swam meaningless across ledgers. His colleagues congratulated him on surviving the storm. Dreadful business, one said over brandy. Having to shelter with those poor frontier folk. Thank heavens you're back among civilized people. Thomas felt rage rise in his throat, clean and clarifying. Jenny wasn't those poor folk. She was the richest person he'd ever met. She'd given him shelter and food and showed him what wealth really meant. She'd taught him more in 3 days than he'd learned in years of business dealings. She'd cracked open his carefully constructed life and shown him the emptiness inside. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He walked through his mansion, touching expensive furniture, looking at oil paintings, counting rooms his children never entered. He thought about Jenny's one-room cabin with its patched walls and mended furniture. 4 people lived there, 6, counting livestock. They had 1 book, 1 table, beans for teaching mathematics. They had more love in that humble space than Thomas had in his entire house. He thought about his children, talented, educated, privileged children who'd never known hardship or want or the kind of struggle that taught you what mattered. They'd never chopped wood or hauled water or made games out of nothing. They'd never learned resourcefulness because everything was provided for them. They'd never learned joy because Thomas had forgotten how to show them. But Jenny knew. Jenny, who made her children laugh despite having nothing. Jenny, who taught mathematics with dried beans and turned a blizzard into an adventure. Jenny, who measured wealth in presence and attention and love. His children didn't need more tutors. They needed Jenny. And Thomas needed to learn alongside them. The idea crystallized slowly, taking shape through sleepless nights and empty days. Not charity, Jenny would refuse that. Not courtship too forward. She'd feel pressured by his wealth and position. But partnership. A practical arrangement both could accept with dignity. He needed someone to teach his children what real wealth meant. She needed security for herself and her children. It was logical, reasonable, mutually beneficial. It might become more. But first, he needed to offer it in a way that respected both their dignities. Thomas ordered his carriage prepared on a bright January morning. His butler asked the destination. The Murphy farm, Thomas said. And this time, I'm asking the right questions. His heart hammered against his ribs. She might refuse. She might laugh at him. She might tell him to take his money and his mansion and leave her in peace. But he had to try. His children needed what she could teach them. He needed to learn it too. And maybe, just maybe, if he did this right, he could build something real with a woman who'd shown him what real meant. The carriage rolled toward the farm, morning sun glittering on snow. Thomas watched the landscape pass and rehearsed his words, hoping desperately that Jenny would say yes. Jenny was chopping wood when Thomas arrived. She looked up at the sound of his carriage. Axe frozen mid-swing. Surprise and wariness crossing her face. The children were at school 3 miles each way. They walked daily despite the cold. Thomas climbed down, his polished boots sinking into snow. He'd brought supplies: flour, salt, sugar, coffee. Not gifts, but trade goods. Fair exchange, not charity. Mr. Brennan, Jenny said carefully, setting down the axe. Is something wrong? No. He stopped several feet away, respecting her space. May I speak with you? She studied him for a long moment, then nodded toward the cabin. Come inside. It's cold. The cabin felt smaller than he remembered, but just as warm. Jenny lit the stove, made coffee from her precious supply. They sat at the table where he'd eaten thin soup and learned about generosity. "Why are you here?" Jenny asked directly. Thomas had rehearsed this speech a dozen times. Now, facing her, the words came out plain and simple. "I have a proposition, not charity, a partnership." Jenny's expression stayed neutral, waiting. "My children need a teacher," Thomas continued, "but not the kind I can hire. They need someone to teach them what you taught me in 3 days. That wealth is kindness. That joy doesn't require money. That generosity of spirit matters more than generosity of purse." "You have tutors," Jenny pointed out. "I have employees," Thomas said. "My children need a person. They need someone who can show them what real wealth means." Jenny crossed her arms. "And what do I get from this arrangement? Security, a teacher's salary, your own quarters in my home, yours and your children's independence." He met her eyes. "You walk your children 6 miles daily in Montana winter to get them to school. You're one hard season from losing this farm. I can provide stability. In exchange, you teach all 4 children together, yours and mine." Jenny stood, paced to the window. "You're asking me to leave my home. I'm asking you to consider an arrangement that benefits both of us." Thomas stayed seated, non-threatening. "Your children would have warm beds and full bellies. You'd have a secure position. My children would have what money can't buy, someone who knows how to teach with beans and songs and stories. Someone who can show them that 7 beans given when 3 were asked shows character." She turned back. "Why would you do this? There are teachers in town." "Because you changed something in me," Thomas said honestly. "Those 3 days showed me what I'd been missing, what my children are missing. I don't want them to grow up as empty as I became. And I think you're the only person who can teach us how to fill that emptiness." Jenny studied him, those sharp eyes seeing everything. Thomas let her look, let her judge. He had nothing to hide now. "On one condition," she said finally. "Name it. Your children spend weekends here, at this farm, learning to chop wood and haul water and make do. If they're going to learn about real wealth, they need to know both sides." "Oh," Thomas felt hope surge in his chest. "Deal. And I keep this farm. I don't sell it or give it up. It's mine. My children's inheritance. Of course, I wouldn't ask you to abandon it." Jenny walked back to the table, stood looking down at him. "This is just business, just an arrangement." Thomas wanted to say more. Wanted to tell her she was beautiful and wise and everything he needed. But that wasn't fair. Not when he held all the power, all the money, all the position. "For now," he said carefully. "Let's start with business. See how it works. If it becomes more," he let the sentence hang. "If it becomes more, it'll happen honest." Jenny finished. "Not because I need your money or you need my teaching, because we choose it." "Yes." Thomas stood, extended his hand. "Partners." Jenny looked at his hand, then took it. Her palm was rough with work, strong despite its size. They shook, the gesture sealing something more than business. "When do we start?" Jenny asked. "Tomorrow," Thomas said. "If you're willing. I'll need to pack, talk to my children, make arrangements for the farm while we're in town. Take whatever time you need." Thomas smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in weeks. "We'll be waiting." He left without touching her again, though he wanted to. Left with hope crackling through his chest like lightning, with possibilities stretching forward into unknown territory. The handshake had lasted a moment longer than necessary. Their eyes had held, acknowledging something unspoken. This was business, a practical arrangement, mutually beneficial partnership, but it might become more, and for the first time in 5 years. Thomas felt alive with anticipation instead of dread. He climbed into his carriage, looked back at Jenny standing in her doorway, She raised one hand in farewell. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow it begins. April arrived with muddy roads and the scent of possibility. 3 months had passed since Jenny moved into Thomas's mansion, bringing Sarah and Billy and a trunk of simple belongings. 3 months of transformation. The library became a classroom, but not like any classroom Thomas had ever seen. Jenny filled it with life mason jars of beans for mathematics, charcoal and boards for writing. Maps she drew herself, songs they sang together. Miss Hartwell and Professor Morrison were dismissed, politely but firmly. Margaret had resented Jenny at first. "I don't need a frontier woman teaching me," she'd said coldly. But Jenny never pushed. She simply started teaching Billy and Sarah, and slowly. Margaret drifted closer to listen. Now she taught Sarah piano not mechanically, but joyfully, laughing when Sarah hit wrong notes, celebrating when she got them right. Thomas Jr. and Billy had become inseparable. The older boy, used to books and theory, discovered he liked building things with his hands. Billy showed him how to carve wood, how to mend broken tools, how to figure things out through trial and error instead of instruction manuals. Weekends, all 6 of them went to the farm. Thomas chopped wood alongside Billy, muscles aching from unfamiliar work, pride swelling when his stack grew straight and even. Margaret learned to cook simple meals with Sarah beans and cornbread and vegetables from last year's garden. Thomas Jr. fixed the barn door that had hung crooked for 2 years. The children, all 4, became siblings in truth, not just arrangement. They bickered and laughed and protected each other. They shared Jenny's attention and didn't fight for it because she gave it freely to all. The town talked. A widow teaching in the banker's home. His children mixing with poor farm children. It was scandalous. Unconventional. Improper. Thomas didn't care. Jenny held her head high, earning her salary through honest work, answering to no one. She taught all 4 children to read the same books, solve the same problems, sing the same songs. She taught them they were equals where it mattered. Between lessons and farm weekends, Thomas and Jenny found moments. Morning coffee before children woke, conversation over books in the library, shared glances when the children did something beautiful, hands brushing when passing supplies, a growing comfort, a deepening trust. One April evening, after the children were asleep, Thomas found Jenny on the mansion's wide porch. She stood at the railing, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and rose. "You've given my children their souls back," Thomas said quietly. Joining her, Jenny smiled without turning. They always had souls. They just needed permission to show them. And Thomas asked, "What have you given me?" She turned then, faced him in the fading light. "Maybe we've given each other something. You showed my children security. I showed yours joy. Together, we've made something new. Could we make something more?" His voice was tentative, not as employer and teacher, as partners, as people who found each other in a storm. Jenny finished softly, and chose to keep finding each other every day after. Thomas reached for her hand. She let him take it, her rough palm fitting against his as naturally as breathing. Not a promise yet, but possibility. The spring wind carried the scent of earth preparing to bloom, of winter finally releasing its grip. "I don't have pretty words," Thomas said. "I'm not good at this." "You're learning," Jenny said. "That's what matters. You're present. You're trying. You're teaching your children what wealth really means. Because you showed me." "We showed each other." She squeezed his hand. "I was surviving before you came. Now I'm living. There's a difference." Behind them, lamplight glowed warm through the mansion's windows. Inside, 4 children slept safe and loved, their dreams full of bean mathematics and wood carving and songs that taught history. They were learning that wealth wasn't measured in dollars but in presence, attention, generosity of spirit. They were learning that family was something you chose and built, not just something you were born into. Thomas looked at their joined hands, then at the woman who'd taught him to see clearly. The storm that trapped them together had opened a door. They'd chosen to walk through it, day by day, lesson by lesson, moment by moment. "I love you," Thomas said simply. "I should have said it sooner." "I know," Jenny replied, and her smile held the sunset. "I've been waiting for you to figure it out." She turned in his arms, and he kissed her there on the porch with the spring wind blowing and the mountains watching and their children sleeping safe inside. It was a beginning, not an ending. A promise to keep choosing each other, keep learning together, keep building this impossible family they'd created from need and circumstance and courage. When they finally pulled apart, Jenny rested her head against his chest. "We have work to do still. Your children are learning, but there's more to teach, mine too. Then we'll teach them together," Thomas said. "Partners." "Partners," Jenny agreed. "And maybe something more." Behind them, the mansion glowed with lamplight. Ahead, the future stretched uncertain but full of possibility. 6 people becoming one family, learning that true wealth was measured in moments like this sunset and spring wind and hands held tight. The arithmetic of the heart, finely balanced. 7 beans given when 3 were asked. Love multiplying instead of dividing. Joy measured not in dollars but in presence, attention, and the courage to let others in. Thomas held Jenny close and felt, for the first time since Elizabeth died, completely whole. The wind carried the scent of new growth. Inside, their children dreamed. Outside, spring promised renewal. And in the space between them, 2 hearts beat in rhythm, keeping time to a song about finding home in unexpected places, learning love in humble moments, and building wealth that would last far beyond any ledger or bank account. They'd found each other in a storm. They'd chosen to build something beautiful from that chance meeting. And the story, Thomas knew, was only beginning.